Oh, sorry, I was turning up. Um, Welcome back to another episode of APUSH Review. Mr. Muller, we got period 7. This is our last period for this year because, as we know, for this exam, this unique exam this year, we are only expected to know up to period 7. So that goes from about 1900 to about 1945. A lot of events in there, so let's try to cover it. And hopefully, this is relatively just a brief synopsis of what we learned not too long ago. Okay, this was most recent these past few months. So let's talk about it. So as you can see here, period 7, I split up the foreign affairs on the left versus the domestic affairs on the right. The foreign affairs include things like imperialism, where we're expanding abroad. We have the Spanish-American War. We then have World War I, which is a huge conflict, obviously. We will talk about the struggle for us to get involved in both world wars. We have the periods in between the wars, which we're going to see the Roaring Twenties, but then also the Great Depression. We will talk about our foreign policy and how it changes throughout this time period, 1900 to about 1945. And then finally, the end of the period comes with World War II, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the right side, domestically, what was going on? We last left off in period 6, talking about the Gilded Age, talking about how America needs reform, they need change, and along comes the Progressive Era, which follows up the Gilded Age. We really talk about the Progressive Era beginning with the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and all the reforms we see during the Roosevelt era, but then it continues under the Taft and Wilson administrations. So we see advancements in things like women's rights and temperance reform, and state reforms, and then finally national reforms in the way people are involved in the voting process. Domestically, in the 1920s, after World War I, we have the Red Scare. We talk about things like Sacco and Vanzetti. We talk about fundamentalist, the Scopes trial, and then also the impact of women now that they have the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. Following the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression follows here with we'll talk about the causes, what leads us into this Great Depression, why does it happen, and then how do we drag ourselves out of it? How does the government respond under the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations? And finally, the impact of World War II here at home, most importantly, the Japanese internment camps. Next, the late 19th century, finishing out the 1800s, which we were kind of talking about last time in the period 6 review. On the left here, you can see we talk about the frontier being closed. We've finally reached our manifest destiny, our sea to shining sea, according to Frederick Jackson Turner, who is a historian, says that's it, it's over. But he does not account for other things like where people are moving in the country now that we've reached California. And the truth is, by 1890, people are no longer moving west. They're actually moving back towards the cities because that's where the jobs are, right? The places like New York and Boston, Chicago, etc. So why is it that we start to expand overseas? Well, imperialism, there's a lot of advantages to imperialism. The economic gains where we can sell more stuff and access more raw materials. The political gains where we can desire to compete with those other countries in Europe who are also doing it, like England, for example. Militarily, Alfred T. Mahan was someone who wrote a book about how it was important for a country like England to become powerful, and the way they did that was through their strong navy. And then you have a guy like Teddy Roosevelt who reads that book and tries to implement that idea of a strong navy in his presidency. So by adding military or naval bases throughout the world, it shows the growing presence of the United States. Lastly, the ideological motives. Well, we have that white man's burden idea that it's our job to civilize, quote unquote, the savages, which is obviously, very messed up. And then some examples of all this stuff on the right. Where do we expand to? Well, we annex Hawaii. We help overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. We get to China, the open door policy, right? Secretary of State John Hay, 1899. The Spanish-American War, where we had the Spanish-American War was caused by 3 things. Must remember these. The USS Maine explodes. We don't know from who, but we blame Spain. Yellow journalism, Hertz and Pulitzer are writing articles in newspapers for Americans to read about how the Spanish are abusing the Cubans. And then the Delome letter, which was basically openly calling McKinley spineless and questioning his power. Okay, how do you think a president responds to such things? Think about modern day. How would Trump respond? Then the turning point for the war is really the beginning of the end, which was the beginning, if that makes sense, meaning that this was a big victory for the United States. It wasn't a very long war, it was about 3 months long. It was actually quoted as being a splendid little war for the United States. The Treaty of Paris, know the year, 1898, because remember, there are three Treaty of Parises. So this Treaty of Paris, 1898, gives us some major territories like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Problem was, we kind of just replaced Spain as being the imperial power, whereas the people in like the Philippines, they were like, wait, I thought you guys were just helping us gain our independence, then leaving. So guys like Emilio Aguinaldo, who fought for us in the Spanish-American War, now is very pissed off at us afterwards, and the Philippines will try to fight back, but they are not successful. This is all part of Roosevelt's foreign policy, his big stick diplomacy, using the Monroe Doctrine or the Roosevelt Corollary, if you will. He is going to implement that kind of mentality in places that we conquer and take over. Also not mentioned was Panama and his Panama Canal. Teddy Roosevelt helps trade and the military. Taft, who comes after Roosevelt, will follow this foreign policy up with dollar diplomacy, where instead of going in with our military to places, he is willing to give money and financially support American businesses in these places we take over. And finally, Wilson, who is moral diplomacy, says, why don't we try to better our relationship with Latin America? And it actually doesn't turn out very well because we wind up having some big fights with Mexico and Pancho Villa, and that leads us, into World War One. Okay, so next up we have debates over America's role in the world. Remember, up to this period, we've really pretty much kept to ourselves unless we were provoked into a war like the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War. We've pretty much kept to ourselves. But now we are becoming these imperialists, right? We want to compete with those Englands and Frances and Germanys of the world, and so we want to go beyond our borders. We are extending that manifest destiny idea. So, as we just talked about, we were expanding into places like Cuba, the Philippines, etc. However, there are a group of people that are against this, right? Your Andrew Carnegie's, for example, who is part of the anti-imperialistic league, people that don't support us imperializing, saying we are, reaching beyond our borders and should not be doing that, and this is unfair to those indigenous cultures that we're going into. So just be aware of those anti-imperialistics. Pre and post World War One, we talked about our foreign policy since the Washington era to this point has been neutral. Okay, so definitely remember foreign policy. That's a huge theme in APUSH. But what drags us into World War One? There are three causes, very similar to the three causes that led us to the Spanish-American War. So definitely know the difference. The Lusitania is sunk, although that is not an American ship that has Americans on it. 120 Americans are killed, just like the Sussex and the Arabic. And we basically say, hey, Germany, what are you doing? You can't do this. We are neutral. Germany says, my bad. We promise not to sink another ship without giving you a heads up. And then the Zimmerman note, this is basically the last straw. After Germany goes back on their word and starts sinking ships once again, the Zimmerman note or telegram is a failed attempt by Germany to reach out to Mexico, who we had beef with, because if you remember about Pancho Villa, they say, hey, listen, Mexico, enter World War One, help us out, and when we win, we'll give you back the territory that you lost during the Mexican-American War, Texas, etc. So this never makes it. The British intercepted. They come right into the Americans, and that's it. America says we're in. Okay, we are no longer neutral. We fast forward through the war. Okay, less than 2 years, World War One is over, and the end of the war brings a huge debate about what to do with the post-war world, not just America. Woodrow Wilson plays a huge role in those negotiations. He wants his 14 points to get pushed through, where he wants things like self-determination and also a League of Nations to be created. Problem is, he's very ahead of his time. Nobody really wants to give all of these things, all these powers to countries. They just want to punish the, the Germans for World War I, which is kind of messed up. The Senate does not like the League of Nations or Article 10, if you remember, Article X. And so Henry Cabot Lodge leads the way in presenting that the Senate doesn't agree with the League of Nations and they reject it. And so Woodrow Wilson's dream is defeated by guys like Henry Cabot Lodge, unfortunately. We are preserving the foreign policy of Washington, and after World War I, Americans are very behind, going back to being neutral, back to being isolated, and try to disconnect from world events. As we know, though, we are very involved in world events during the 1920s and 30s, but we'll get there. As far as the 1920s, the isolationist policies, we said we were going to keep. Like I said, though, we were very involved in world affairs like the Washington Naval Conference, which was limiting the countries around the world, their navies. But we were allowed to have the biggest navy along with England, so that means we're very involved in world politics. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlaws war, was stupid though because there was no punishment for going to war. And then the Dawes Act, okay, or the Dawes Plan, if you will, which lent money to our allies so that everybody could pay off their war debt. Neutrality acts under Roosevelt in the 1930s are going to keep us out of war as things start to heat up in Europe and Asia, but ultimately Pearl Harbor is going to bring us into World War II. Now, I want you guys to pay attention to this slide. Here's what I actually do think this year's exam is going to cover, and they like this topic a lot. The progressive movement. Okay, this is the answer, the response to the Gilded Age, which we talked about in the last period. So progressive reformers, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to change? Economic instability, social inequalities, and political corruption. Okay, they want the government to get involved. Well, how exactly are they going to do that? They want reforms or changes in the cities where people are living horribly, people aren't being paid much, there's little social mobility, there's very little women participation. They want to change that. And so the muckrakers, your Jacob Reeses, your Upton Sinclairs, okay, your Ida Tarbell, they are going to flip the switch and try to reveal the bad stuff going on in America and try to get that reform by the government. So let's talk about some of these reforms specifically. Jane Addams and the Hull House in Chicago, she was an immigrant herself and basically said it's very hard to assimilate into American society. So she sets up the Hull House to try to allow immigrants to take English classes, bring their kids to childcare, and assimilate into society a little bit easier. Florence Kelley in the National Consumer League, she fights for things like food safety, child labor. As we know, these things are very bad. John Muir, we talked about him last time. He teams up with Teddy Roosevelt and puts conservation on the map as a national issue for nature. Awesome. Robert LaFalle, we talked about him in Wisconsin. He's the guy that leads for the democratization of America, where like things like recall, referendum, initiative, they were Wisconsin ideas. They were things that gave people more of a say in the voting process in Wisconsin, but then it winds up becoming a national thing. And we do have these things today where we as citizens can recall politicians from offices, or we can create an initiative to create a law, for example. The 17th Amendment, okay, this was passed during the progressive movement. The direct election of senators, interesting. Never thought we didn't have that before, right? Theodore Roosevelt uses the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies like the railroad he focuses on. Later on, during Wilson's administration, he couples that with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which also continued to break up trusts. We call Teddy Roosevelt the trust-busting president. However, Taft and Wilson break up more trusts. So why does he get the title? Well, because not only is he an awesome beard and mustache, but he's really the first president to do this. And finally, Wilson, the Federal Reserve Bank. This was created in 1913. This is the first time we've seen a national bank since Andrew Jackson. Very good. Okay, when he vetoed the second bank all the way back during 1836. Okay, so as we push through this industrialization and urban country that we're becoming, remember the second industrial revolution that we talked about during the last period, we saw the rise of large corporations, your JP Morgans, your Henry Fords, your Carnegies, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts. By 1920, more Americans are living in cities than rural areas, and this is something that is relatively new for our country's history. Remember, we've always kind of been a agricultural based society. Now we are becoming a more industrial society. New technology in the 1920s are big. So definitely know that the technologies like the radio, the vacuum, the Model T, movie, Hollywood, Disney World, all that stuff. This changes life for many Americans who now have more leisure time because of certain laws that are being passed. New opportunities for new groups, immigrants. This is the new wave of immigration. After the Civil War, we talk about people coming to this country from places like Southern and Eastern Europe, your Italy's, your Russia, even Asia, okay, Japan and China. Women get a huge victory in this period 7 by the right to vote right after World War One, and in World War Two they do the same thing as far as taking the jobs of the men who went off to war. So definitely know the impact of women during this time period. But what's surprising is after World War Two, we see in the 1950s, we'll see women kind of revert back to that cult of domesticity, which is very interesting. But your flappers in the 1920s was a huge step for women because now they have the right to vote, they had some jobs, they had some money, they want to go out, have fun, start families later on in life, and flappers are very revolutionary. So don't forget about your flappers. African Americans during both world wars, we see the Great Migrations, the first and the second Great Migrations. They're leaving the Jim Crow South to go to the North. What's in the North? Well, those factory jobs. Next, cultural, political, and social tensions emerge from all this moving and changing in demographics and modernization of America. World War I in the Roaring Twenties, we see some limitations on people's rights. The Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed during World War I, which basically said you do not have freedom of speech, which a lot of people were upset about. Charles Schenck, who was accused of distributing pamphlets. He sent pamphlets out to people trying to persuade them to dodge the draft, which is illegal. He is brought to court, and they said basically, sorry, you do not have the freedom of speech during times of war because of national security. And so that is a court case to definitely no. The Red Scare and the Palmer Raids in the 1920s, we see people very scared of communism because the Bolshevik Revolution happened, Russia left World War I, and people are very scared in America that we too might be susceptible to communism. So the guys like Sacco and Vanzetti, who are immigrants, they are anarchists. They are accused of killing their boss in Massachusetts. We had no proof, but they are unfortunately put on trial and then later on killed for being the people that pulled the trigger to kill their boss. Meanwhile, we find out years later they had nothing to do with it. So why did they die? Because they were not fans of democracy. They were immigrants and the Red Scare. Okay, just the victims of circumstance, unfortunately. Speaking of immigrants and our fears of them, we wind up limiting the amount of immigrants coming into our country during the 1920s, like the Immigration Act in 1924, the Quota Acts. Basically said we're only going to allow 2% of immigrants coming in from each country according to the 1890 census. It means, hey, listen, if 100 people came from Germany in 1890, okay, we're only going to allow 2% of those 100 Germans in 1890, which means 2 Germans are coming in 1924. So that's really, really small number. This was supported by the KKK, which is now revised. Okay, they're making a comeback. They no longer just hate African Americans, they hate um, immigrants and they hate Jews. Okay, so they once again, okay, are coming back and adding to their hate list. You see this very nativist idea in the 1920s by Americans. The Scopes trial is an example of fundamentalism. This was the biology teacher who in Tennessee is brought to court for teaching his kids the theory of evolution, that we evolved from monkeys. Meanwhile, these people did not like that idea. They wanted that their children to be learning the idea that we all were created by God, the theory of creation, and so he is going to lose the case and told he cannot teach that. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, we see huge impacts of this, the rise of organized crime, the rum runners, the speakeasies, okay, guys like Al Capone, all right, those are all effects of the 18th Amendment. And then finally, African Americans, we talked about their great migrations to the northern cities because of those jobs. Okay, so let's finish this all up, talking about the 1930s and World War II. So, the New Deal. Okay, the Great Depression begins 1929, the stock market crashes. Herbert Hoover doesn't do too much to help the situation. He believes in rugged individualism, that we should pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. The banks are failing, farmers in the Dust Bowl, things are bad. Along comes Roosevelt in 1932, and his New Deal, his domestic plan, is in three parts. The three R's: relief, provide jobs; recovery, help the banks and the economy; and reform, prevent another depression from happening. The New Deal reforms our society by opening up this welfare state that we've never seen before. We've never seen the government really supply jobs and also assistance to people. So what are some of the programs that Roosevelt makes very popular? The FDIC is very important. This is helping the banks out. This is a recovery program. This basically says that the banks are insuring your money, and even if they close, you're going to be guaranteed at that time $2,500, today $250,000. The SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, still around today as well, regulates the stock market, makes sure people aren't making bad investments and everybody's telling the truth on how much their companies are making. The AAA helps the farmers, another relief program. This actually pays them to prevent overproduction. It says, hey, listen, we're going to pay you to only seed a portion of your crops. All right, and this helps farmers, right? The Dust Bowl we talked about being their big issue. The WPA, the CCC, these are both relief programs because they provide people, usually young males, with unemployment opportunities like building parks, planting trees, etc. Okay, these public works projects. The Wagner Act, or also called the National Labor Relations Act, is protecting the rights of workers. So once again, we're seeing the government take the side of the workers like they did in the progressive era, synthesis point, right? Social Security still around today as well. One of the long-lasting programs here. It helps a couple of groups of people. Make sure you know who the Social Security Act helps. One, it helps the elderly, right? They're retired. They need help. They can't work anymore. It helps those who are disabled. Remember, Roosevelt himself is disabled. That's why he puts that in there. And it also helps unemployment compensation, right? If you lose your job, you can get unemployment compensation. Today, that's about $600 per week. Evaluating the New Deal, some people love it, some people hated it. Okay, it creates a welfare state. We've never seen this before. And since the New Deal, we've kind of had some sort of a welfare state. Welfare means the government helping you. Okay, we've never really seen the government get involved, right? We've always seen the government take an approach like laissez-faire. The New Deal programs that are still around today, I mentioned a bunch like Social Security and FDIC. I would definitely know those two in particular. Reforms are from the New Deal. We can synthesize them. We can connect them to the progressive era reforms, like we talked about Teddy Roosevelt. We could also connect them to the Fair Deal programs under Truman and the Great Society programs under Lyndon Johnson. I would know some of these. This is another possible topic for this year's exam with this DBQ. They love the New Deal and they love you guys connecting it to other times of reform like the Progressive Era or Lyndon Johnson, which we're not going to see this year on this exam. So what kind of people didn't like the New Deal? Well, you have people that said that we didn't do enough. Guys like Huey Long. He is kind of like your old-fashioned Bernie Sanders who wanted to give people a check and free college education and a brand new car. And then he's assassinated. Then you have people like conservatives who thought that too much was being done. The government was being increased to a size that was unsustainable, okay, not good. Too much deficit spending. Deficit spending means that we're spending money to make money. We're kind of like what we're doing right now in this current situation where we're throwing money into people's pockets hoping that they will spend it. The Supreme Court also doesn't like some of Roosevelt's programs, right? They are going to deem some of them unconstitutional, and you're going to see Roosevelt try to pack the court. The New Deal does not end our depression, but it does help us cope with the depression. Okay, and finally, what does end the depression? World War II and the production. Speaking of World War II, let's wrap this all up. Okay, World War II ends the Great Depression for us. We see women get involved, right? New opportunities for women in the workplace. Rosie the Riveter. You see Mexican Americans Be very important. The Bracero program is created to welcome Mexican farm workers into the country. You see African Americans fighting not only in the war to end things like fascism overseas, but also at home fighting discrimination. We call that the Double V campaign that sets up the civil rights movement, which comes right after World War II. In Japanese internment camps that are set up by Executive Order 8802. This is kind of messed up of us. We throw these Japanese people in these camps. We're not killing them, but they're not allowed to leave. Why? Well, two reasons: Pearl Harbor, and also we think they might be spies. Fred Korematsu, he's one of these people that's in an internment camp. He sues, and the U.S. Supreme Court says, sorry, we're allowed to do this because of national security. Mexican Americans in the Zoot Suit riots out in LA, they also are facing discrimination. They riot, and this also ends pretty unsuccessful for them. Scientific and technological advancements during World War II. The most famous is the atomic bomb. We all know that. Manhattan Project, awesome. And sonar, okay, which allows you to see when planes are, coming close to you. The United States, after World War II, becomes the industrial power of the world. We have the atomic bomb. We are in the best economic shape after the war. So everybody looks to us to guide the post-World War II world. The big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, are going to dictate what's going to happen after the war is over through things like the Tehran Conference, Atlantic Conference, and Yalta Conference, where we do things like split up Germany, try to open up a second front during the war to help Stalin and to help each other out, like with the Atlantic Conference. After World War II is over, though, okay, a lot of changes in the post-war world, a lot of changes in what the world's going to look like, and obviously the Cold War is going to happen right after World War II, but we, for this year, are not concerned about that. Okay, a lot of information. I do think this year's exam is going to cover period 7, so I really hope you paid attention. Obviously, you can click pause, you can take notes on this stuff, but I really suggest you know period 7 very well, the ins and outs, a lot of different topics in period 7 here. Other than that, if you felt this helped you, if you liked the video, give me a like, subscribe, do what you got to do. Other than that, peace out. I'm going to go back to turning up. Deuces.